Okay, let's unpack this a bit. It's a fact that often flies under the radar.
Hmm.
The 20th century, well, it saw Christianity become the most widespread religion on the planet.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Right. I mean, think about it. There are Christian communities now in every single inhabited country.
Everywhere.
For the first time, the church is truly global. So what sparked this huge expansion? And I guess, what does it mean now that the church isn't just centered in one place anymore?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
That's the fascinating question we're diving into today.
And what's really interesting here, I think, is that this new global reality, it's led to what lots of people are calling a new paradigm of mission.
A new paradigm.
Yeah, because when the church is a global body, not just mainly Western, it completely changes how we understand its mission, its purpose in the world.
Right. It's a long way from that old picture of like Western missionaries heading off to faraway lands.
Exactly.
We've sifted through, well, quite a range of missiological texts. That's basically the study of Christian mission for anyone unfamiliar, and church history analyses to try and get a handle on this.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. So our mission for you today is to understand the key shifts, the changes in thinking, and the sort of theological responses that have shaped how Christians approach mission right now.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So let's maybe start by looking at how mission thinking reacted, how it responded to that whole modern missionary movement era, especially across the 20th century.
Okay.
And one of the biggest changes, I think, is about where mission happens.
Okay, so historically, the picture was mostly one way, wasn't it? Like 19th century, lots of missionaries going from Europe, North America,
Right.
to what we now call the Global South. The focus was taking the gospel out there.
Precisely. That was the dominant model. But then the 20th century, it brought this crucial wake-up call.
Which was?
Well, two things, really. First, the realization that the West wasn't nearly as Christian as everyone assumed. And at the same time, you saw this incredible growth, explosive growth of the church in Africa, Asia, Latin America.
Right, the demographics shifted dramatically.
Exactly. And that led to this really profound shift in perspective. Bishop Michael Nazir-Ali put it really well, saying, mission is now understood as from everywhere to everywhere.
From everywhere to everywhere, I like that.
It's no longer a one-way street from the West out to the rest of the world. It's multi-directional.
That makes total sense, especially now with how connected everything is and how, like you said, the center of gravity for Christianity has really moved.
Yeah.
It's almost mind-blowing when you think that places once seen only as mission fields are now sending their own missionaries out.
It's a complete reversal in many ways.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. This also meant realizing mission isn't just about crossing borders, geographically speaking.
That's such a crucial point. The focus expanded. It wasn't just cross-cultural mission over there anymore. It was also recognizing the urgent need for mission within Western culture itself.
Right here at home, so to speak.
Exactly. People like Leslie Newbegin, Wilbert Schenck, they were real pioneers here. They basically said, look, Western culture, even though it looks secular on the surface, it has its own deep-seated beliefs, its own idols, you could say, its own idolatry, and it desperately needs a missionary encounter too.
So even in societies that seem non-religious, there are these underlying values, these worldviews that might clash with the gospel message.
Absolutely. Foundational assumptions that need challenging.
That's a powerful idea. And it's got global relevance too, hasn't it? Because Western culture is so dominant, especially in cities everywhere.
You got it. Churches all over the world, particularly in these fast-growing cities, they're constantly figuring out how to live out the gospel faithfully when their own local cultures bump up against this globalizing Western influence.
It's a constant negotiation.
It really is. And this realization, it also affected how people thought about mission agencies and the church itself.
Okay, so what was the old way of thinking there? It often felt like mission was this separate thing, right? Handled by special societies.
Yeah, historically that was often the case. Partly because, well, established churches in the West didn't always fully embrace their own missionary calling.
So other groups stepped in.
Exactly. These separate organizations popped up to do the work. And sometimes that created a bit of a divide. The church back home might just support mission, sending money or whatever. Well, out on the field, you had these mission structures kind of operating alongside, maybe sometimes separate from the local church that was emerging.
Also, like two parallel tracks.
Yeah, something like that. But in the 20th century, there's been this growing theological understanding, people call it missionary ecclesiology,
Right.
that the church, by its very nature, is missionary. It's not an optional extra. It's core to its identity to be involved in grand mission.
So the church is the mission agency, in a sense.
In a fundamental sense, yes. Now, people still debate the role of specific mission societies and structures. That conversation continues.
Sure.
But the basic idea that the church itself is missionary, that's gained huge traction. And this ties right into another really key development, how the gospel gets expressed in different cultures.
Ah, yes, contextualization. You hear that word a lot. So because the church was mostly Western for so long, the gospel kind of got wrapped up in Western clothes, culturally speaking.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
For centuries, there wasn't much deep engagement with non-Western cultures. So people didn't really think about the fact that the gospel had already been contextualized, adapted to Western culture.
Just seemed like the way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So when Western missionaries went out, they naturally shared the message, mixed in with Western ways of thinking, Western assumptions, Western practices.
And I imagine that sometimes caused problems, like maybe it made Christianity seem foreign, like a Western import.
For sure. What made sense in London or Chicago might not connect in Lagos or Lima. It could feel alienating. So the 20th century brought this growing awareness, this need to unwrap the gospel from its Western packaging and translate it authentically into all these diverse cultures.
Translate it.
Yeah, Lim Senna talks about this really helpfully. He contrasts diffusion, just spreading one cultural version, with translation, where the gospel really engages deeply with a new culture and new, authentic, local expressions of faith emerge.
So the gospel actually takes root, finds a home in that new soil.
Exactly. It becomes indigenous.
But wow, that raises some huge questions, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what does a faithful version of the gospel look like in a totally different culture? And how do you make sure it's still the same gospel across all these different expressions? How do you keep that unity?
Those are the million-dollar questions. Seriously, that's the heart of the ongoing discussion about contextualization, finding that balance being truly relevant culturally while staying totally faithful theologically.
Tricky stuff.
Very. And this leads us right into another really important theological shift, the idea of missio Dei.
Missio Dei. Okay, Latin. Mission of God.
You got it. Mission of God. So how did our view of mission change here?
Yeah, what was the old view?
Well, historically, especially with the Enlightenment's influence, all that focus on human reason and progress, mission sometimes became very human-centered, anthropocentric, lots of emphasis on human effort, strategy, planning, our ability to bring the gospel, to fix the world.
Like we were the main actors driving mission forward.
Kind of, yeah. Maybe tied up sometimes with the perceived benefits of Western civilization, too.
Okay.
So the theological correction, or maybe rediscovery, was missio Dei. The understanding that fundamentally, mission is God's work. It starts with God. It's driven by God. The church's role isn't to invent or control mission, but to discern what God is already doing in the world and join in, participate.
That feels like a much more humble stance, doesn't it?
It is, definitely.
Recognizing we're part of something much bigger. Okay. And speaking of big shifts, the 20th century also saw the rise of liberation movements. That must have impacted mission thinking, too.
Hugely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
As countries in the global south got political independence, it became obvious that economic dependence on the West often just continued.
Right. The structures didn't necessarily change.
Exactly. And the standard development model started getting critiqued as maybe just another form of economic colonialism,
Okay.
So liberation movements sprang up, saying the real issue isn't just lack of development, it's injustice. It's domination baked into these global economic systems.
So it wasn't just about charity or aid anymore. It was about tackling the root causes of poverty and oppression.
Precisely. Thinkers like José Miguel Bonino were huge here, talking about liberation from domination and dependence. This massively influenced theologies coming out of Latin America, Africa, Asia. It called for mission to get actively involved in struggles for justice.
That's a major shift in focus.
It is. And this critique also kind of turned inward, looking at how Western missions themselves had historically operated, often from positions of, power and wealth.
Right. The whole colonial context must have shaped those early missions, even unintentionally creating a sense of superiority.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Kazuke Koyama talked about a kind of crusading mind or a teacher complex that could creep in.
Mm.
Even way back, Roland Allen contrasted Western approaches with the Apostle Paul, noting Westerners sometimes acted like superior beings doling out resources.
Oof.
And David Bosch, he really pushed for mission in weakness, mission in vulnerability, following the model of the cross, embracing suffering, not just projecting strength.
So moving away from that position of strength and perceived having it all figured out.
Exactly. To embracing vulnerability, seeing mission as mirroring Christ's own way, which emphasizes partnership, not paternalism.
That really is a profound shift. It makes me think of V.S. Azariah, the Indian bishop, at that famous 1910 Edinburgh conference.
Yes. What a moment. Azariah pleaded, really passionately, for genuine partnership, mutual learning between Western and non-Western Christians.
Working together as equals.
Worshiping together, growing together, and understanding Christ. That call for partnership became absolutely central to how mission was reimagined.
So that old one-way street idea was really being challenged.
Definitely.
But actually making that shift to equal partnership, that must have been, and maybe still is, really hard given the history and the power imbalances.
Oh, incredibly hard. And yes, ongoing. The International Missionary Council meeting in Whitby, 1947, they coined that great phrase, partnership in obedience.
Partnership and obedience.
Yes, emphasizing that all churches everywhere face the same core missionary tasks. They're meant to be equal partners.
But the reality.
Well, as missiologists like Vinath Ramachandra point out, the continuing financial, spiritual, administrative weight of the older Western churches, it can still make true partnership difficult. Power dynamics are real.
Still working on it then.
Definitely requires real intention, deep listening, mutual respect. It's a journey.
A journey, right? And on that journey, the understanding of salvation itself, what that even means, that also broadened out, didn't it?
Hugely, yes. Back in the sort of Christendom era, salvation was often seen mostly as spiritual, mostly about the future going to heaven. Social concerns were often kind of separate.
Like important, maybe, but secondary.
Yeah, or seen as maybe a good deed you do after conversion, or maybe even just a way to get to preach the gospel and save souls for eternity. A very soul-focused view.
Okay.
Then the Enlightenment comes along with its focus on human reason, progress on Earth through science, technology, that really challenged the purely spiritual view.
Right, made people think more about this life.
Exactly. But it often created this awkward tension. Sometimes people tried a comprehensive approach where you sort of tack on social action, but it wasn't always deeply integrated theologically.
Like two separate boxes.
A bit, yeah. Theologian J.H. Babank called out that dualism, spiritual salvation here, enlightenment progress there, kind of sitting side by side uneasily.
Gotcha.
So the trend now in contemporary missiology is really towards a more holistic salvation.
Holistic, meaning?
Meaning it embraces present and future, individual and society, soul and body, spiritual and material. It sees evangelism and social justice not as either, but as both intrinsically linked, inseparable expressions of the gospel itself.
Because God's reign covers everything.
Exactly. It's about understanding Christ's work comprehensively. And often, the church itself has to overcome its own internal divisions and dualisms that culture imposes on us.
That makes a lot of sense. If the gospel is about all of life, salvation should touch all of life. And this bigger view of salvation, it seems connected to the whole issue of church unity, too.
Oh, absolutely connected. The 20th century brought this growing, really profound realization. Unity and mission are tied together. You can't really separate them.
How so?
Well, the sheer scandal of a divided church became really obvious, especially out on the mission field. How can you preach a message of reconciliation when Christians themselves are all split up into competing groups?
Yeah, that's not a great look.
Exactly. The church historian Kenneth Scott Latourette famously said the whole ecumenical movement, the push for Christian unity, it basically grew out of the missionary movement.
Wow. So the practical need for a credible witness actually drove the desire for unity.
It was a huge factor. Think about Jesus' prayer in John 17, that they may be one, so that the world may believe. That became a really central driving concern.
Okay.
So the ecumenical tradition, especially through the World Council of Churches, the WCC, they've really hammered this point. Visible unity is essential for effective mission.
And other traditions.
Well, evangelical traditions often emphasize more spiritual unity, unity based on shared core doctrines, as the basis for working together. And the Roman Catholic Church, especially since Vatican II, they've also made big steps in recognizing faith in other Christians, talking more about common witness.
So there's agreement that unity matters, but maybe different ideas about what it looks like or how to get there.
Exactly. And there are still tough questions people wrestle with.
Like what?
Like, does the focus on unity sometimes distract from urgent needs for justice or peace? What does real biblical unity actually mean in practice?
Yeah.
How do old denominations relate to this bigger vision? How do different theologies of the church, different ecclesiologies fit together?
Lots to figure out still.
For sure. But despite the challenges, that goal of unity for mission's sake, it's still a really critical issue for lots of
It
Christians.
seems like a constant balancing act. And another huge reality the church had to face, especially as the world got smaller, was religious pluralism, dealing with other faiths.
Oh, massively important, yeah. For a lot of history, different religions were mostly geographically separate, right? But the modern world, with all the travel, communication, migration, plus the surprising fact that many world religions kept growing, they didn't just fade away with secularization like some people predicted.
Right.
That created a totally new situation. Suddenly, Christians were encountering vibrant, deeply rooted, growing faiths everywhere. The old Western missionary view, which sometimes saw Christianity as just obviously superior and bound to replace everything else,
Yeah.
that just didn't hold up when faced with the reality on the ground.
So that distance, that sense of separation, wasn't really an option anymore.
Not at all. The church had to figure out how to relate, how to engage with this reality of religious pluralism. And, well, that's led to a whole spectrum of responses within Christianity.
A spectrum.
Yeah, everything from, relativistic views saying all religions are basically equal paths to more exclusivist views saying salvation is found only through faith in Jesus Christ.
And lots in between, I imagine.
Lots in between. And the big question everyone's still debating is, how should the church, as part of its mission, relate to people of other faiths? What's the right approach? What does the Bible actually teach? It's maybe one of the thorniest, most pressing issues for the global church today.
Definitely complex. And speaking of huge global shifts, there's the move to cities, urbanization. That must have massive implications for mission, too.
Absolutely massive. That image of the missionary going to a remote village, it's still true in some places, sure, but it doesn't really capture the main demographic reality anymore, does it? The world is overwhelmingly urban now.
So mission has to be urban, too.
Has to be. The sheer number of people in cities demands the church's focus, its resources. Plus, cities are these intense hubs, right? Culture, economics, ideas, religion. It all mixes and spreads from urban centers.
They're incredibly influential.
Totally. So any serious thinking about mission today has got to grapple with global urban mission. You've even got these megacities now, huge urban zones that cross national lines. It's a whole new frontier.
Wow, okay. And alongside all these developments in the more established traditions, you mentioned this explosive growth of a third force.
Yes. Pentecostalism, its global impact is just undeniable.
Can't ignore it.
Right. For a long time, you mainly thought of Protestant and Catholic missions. But Pentecostalism has just surged, especially in the 20th century and in the 21st, as this incredibly vibrant, fast-growing movement. It brings its own distinct flavor, its own contributions to global mission.
Especially in the global south.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Africa, Latin America, Asia. Its growth there is reshaping the face of Christianity. And it offers, well, often challenging perspectives, especially its intense focus on the Holy Spirit's power and active role in mission.
Okay.
And that emphasis, it's increasingly feeding back into the wider Christian conversation, too.
It's really fascinating how all these things connect the church going global, questioning Western assumptions, the cry for justice, facing religious diversity, the move to cities, the rise of Pentecostalism. It all feeds into this new paradigm of mission.
Exactly. It's a confluence of forces.
So maybe now we can dig a bit deeper into some of the specific traditions today. How are they actually living out these shifts?
Yeah, let's do that. We can start with the Protestant ecumenical tradition. As we mentioned, it really traces its modern roots back to that 1910 Edinburgh Conference.
Right, the birthplace of the modern ecumenical movement?
And eventually leading to the World Council of Churches, the WCC, and its mission arm, the CWME. They've produced some really key documents over the years like Mission and Evangelism and Ecumenical Affirmation, Mission and Evangelism and Unity Today, Together Towards Life. These really spell out their core thinking.
Okay, and what are those core commitments? Unity, we know, is huge for them.
Absolutely central, that link between unity and mission. But also a very strong focus on engaging with contemporary issues, globalization, postmodernity, pluralism, justice, peace, the environment.
Trying to be relevant to the world's concerns.
Very much so. They do a lot of deep analysis of cultural trends.
Which is a strength, right? It keeps missiology relevant. And honestly, many of the big ideas we've been talking about, missionary church, missio Dei, contextualization, they were really developed and pushed forward in these ecumenical circles.
But I guess the flip side of trying so hard to be relevant, is there a danger of just following trends or maybe watering things down?
That's the potential pitfall, yeah. The desire for relevance can sometimes, maybe inadvertently, lead towards syncretism, blending Christian faith with other ideas in ways that might compromise the gospel.
Okay.
And generally, compared to, say, evangelicals, there's often a wider tolerance for diverse theological views within the ecumenical movement.
On things like, oh, the exact relationship between evangelism and social action, which gets priority. Different takes on missio Dei. Does the world set the agenda or the church? How do we understand Christ in the Spirit? Approaches to other religions, you'll find more inclusivist or even pluralist views here. How exactly do gospel and culture interact without syncretism? Even the urgency of global evangelism might be felt differently by some.
So a lot of internal diversity.
Definitely. But one thing that's really shifting the dynamic is the growing voice and influence of Christians from the Global South within the WCC. That's definitely shaping the conversation now.
That makes sense, bringing different priorities, different experiences. Okay, what about the Protestant evangelical tradition? How have they shaped things?
Well, as we touched on, the evangelical tradition largely charted a separate course from the WCC-focused ecumenical movement. Think Lausanne movement.
Right, in 1974.
Exactly. The Lausanne Congress was pivotal.
Yeah.
And the Lausanne Covenant that came out of it, still incredibly influential, really a defining statement for global evangelicalism.
And what are the hallmarks of their approach to mission?
The big catchphrase you hear all the time is the whole church taking the whole gospel to the whole world.
Okay.
And there's a really strong emphasis on world evangelization, which is usually understood primarily as verbally proclaiming the gospel message.
Proclamation first.
Generally, yes. While social action isn't ignored, the direct sharing of the gospel, calling for individual conversion, that's typically seen as the top priority.
Got it.
You also see a very strong, unwavering commitment to the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, that he's the only way to salvation, the absolute need for personal faith and conversion. And generally, an exclusivist view of other religions, salvation is only through Christ.
So a very clear focus on getting the message out and seeing people make individual commitments.
Exactly. And that fuels a huge passion for cross-cultural missions, reaching unreached people groups, planting churches. That's core evangelical missiology.
Any potential weaknesses or critiques people point to?
Well, some might say there can be a tendency towards individualism, maybe sometimes neglecting the bigger cosmic or community aspects of salvation. Maybe sometimes less emphasis on visible church unity compared to ecumenicals. And historically, perhaps a bit more caution about deep engagement in social justice, sometimes fearing a social gospel that might distract from evangelism.
But is that changing?
Oh, definitely. It's important to say there's a really significant and growing movement within evangelicalism that sees social, economic, political engagement as absolutely vital parts of Christian witness. That's a major development.
Okay, so both the ecumenical and evangelical streams bring really valuable, though maybe different perspectives. Let's talk Roman Catholic tradition. You said Vatican II was a huge turning point.
Massive. Yeah, the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65, is a watershed. Documents like Lumen Gentium on the Church, Ad Gentes on mission, Gaudium et Spes on the Church in the modern world, Nostra Aetate on non-Christian religions, they really open things up.
In what way?
The whole mindset shifted. The council affirmed that the church, by its very nature, is missionary. It's not just something some priests or nuns do. It's for the whole church.
Okay.
And later documents like Pope Paul VI's Evangelii Nuntiandi and John Paul II's Redemptoris Missio really built on that, fleshing out what it means.
So what are the big themes in Catholic mission thinking now?
Well, several key things stand out. First, mission flows from God, from the Trinity's love. It's God's initiative.
Like Missio Dei?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Second, proclamation sharing the gospel message about Jesus is still central, and it's everyone's job. Third, liberation is important, but understood holistically, spiritual, social, material, though often with the spiritual having a certain priority.
Okay.
Fourth, dialogue with other religions is seen as part of evangelization, not opposed to it. It comes from a more positive view of other faiths, generally an inclusivist stance seeing God's grace potentially at work beyond the church's visible borders. Fifth, enculturation, like contextualization, is key. It's seen as this two-way street where the gospel changes a culture, but the church is also enriched by that culture. You preserve the good things.
Mutual enrichment.
Yeah. Sixth, mission is complex, holistic. It includes witness, service, dialogue, proclamation, all interconnected. And finally, there's a big focus now on mission to modern culture, sometimes called re-evangelization, critiquing things like secularism and consumerism.
Wow, that sounds really comprehensive. A lot of different facets integrated together. Now, what about the Eastern Orthodox tradition? You sometimes hear they're not as focused on mission.
True. Yeah. It's a common perception, yeah. And historically, maybe due to periods of oppression, their outward activity was sometimes limited. But there's been a real renewal of interest since the mid-20th century, and they're very involved ecumenically, like in the WCC.
Okay.
But their understanding of mission is deeply, deeply rooted in their theology, especially their view of the church, their ecclesiology.
So how do they see mission?
Fundamentally, it flows from God's love for the world. Big emphasis on the incarnation, God becoming human, and the resurrection alongside the cross. Very Trinitarian mission is sharing the very life and communion of God.
Okay.
And crucially, they really believe ecclesiology determines missiology. The church itself, just by being the church, embodies the gospel.
The church is the message, in a way.
Exactly. So witness happens primarily through the liturgy, through worship. The invitation is basically come and see.
Ah.
The liturgy isn't just a service. It has cosmic significance connecting heaven and earth, past, present, future. And that worship then flows out into daily life, the liturgy after the liturgy.
Dimming it out.
Right. And it's inherently holistic, addressing all of life, speaking against injustice. For the Orthodox, the church doesn't just do mission, the church is mission.
That's a powerful perspective. Very focused on being rather than just doing, perhaps. Okay, finally, Pentecostalism. You highlighted it as this unique, fast-growing force.
Yeah, definitely a third force, operating a bit outside the usual Protestant Catholic boxes. Its incredible global growth, especially its strength in the Global South, implicitly challenges a lot of Western Enlightenment-shaped theology.
Right.
Now, defining Pentecostal charismatic is tricky. It's so diverse. But generally, you see this focus on the Holy Spirit's active, dynamic work today. Supernatural gifts, power encounters, very participatory, lively worship, and this incredible passion for evangelism.
Okay. So what are the key mission themes for Pentecostals?
Proclamation is huge. There's often a strong sense of eschatological urgency. Jesus is coming soon. We need to get the message out now, often linked to premillennial views. And absolutely central is the Holy Spirit. Pentecostalism's biggest contribution, arguably, is highlighting the Spirit's role in empowering believers for mission, equipping them with boldness and gifts.
Spirit-empowered mission.
Exactly. There's often an emphasis on doing overthinking, which some criticize, but it's also a powerful challenge to dry intellectualism or naturalism. They expect God to act supernaturally.
Healings, exorcisms, that kind of thing.
Yes, spiritual warfare, prayer, expecting direct divine intervention that's often very prominent. And practically, they have an amazing at mobilizing everyone, not just leaders, for outreach, especially among the urban poor. And their worship style is clearly a major factor in their growth.
But are there areas they're still developing theologically?
Sure. Questions remain about incorporating a fully holistic gospel, though some progressive Pentecostals are working on that, engaging deeply with culture, avoiding individualism, maybe developing a more robust Trinitarian theology, refining their eschatology. These are ongoing discussions within the movement.
It's truly amazing, isn't it, seeing these 5 distinct streams, ecumenical, evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal, all contributing in their own ways to this evolving picture of Christian mission today.
It really is. You get this complex, dynamic landscape now. There are more shared understandings emerging across traditions, for sure, but also these distinct gifts and emphasis that each tradition continues to bring. And it's important to remember, we've talked mostly about the theology, the ideas, putting this stuff into practice in all the messy realities around the world. That's always the ongoing challenge. No tradition gets it perfectly right.
Right. It's a constant work in progress. Learning from each other, adapting, trying to be more faithful to the mission God gives the church in this crazy changing world.
Exactly. And maybe that leads to a final thought for you listening in. As you've heard about all these shifts, these different theological responses, which ones resonate most with you? Which ideas challenge you? How might thinking about this reshape your understanding of the global church, its purpose, its calling today?
That's a good question to ponder.
Maybe digging into some of the writers or documents mentioned could take you deeper. But really just reflecting on how these global shifts impact our own context, our own participation in God's mission. That's incredibly valuable as we navigate the 21st century together.